Afternoon all. I thought we could have a look at the very exciting recent game of Viswanathan Anand against Andreikin. From the start of the game we looked at the critical position, and that was very interesting to explore. But let's have a look at the start and all the way through this game. Played in round 12, I believe, on the 27th of March. So Vishy played e4 and Dmitry Andreikin played the Caro-Kann. Magnus Carlsen had also played the Caro-Kann against Viswanathan Anand in the recent World Chess Championship last year in 2013. And this variation is the same, actually. It seems the same as that previous game that Vishy had against Magnus. So here, bishop g6, h4 threatens to win the bishop. And usually on livebook, black plays h6. That's the overwhelming choice in this position. h5 kind of weakens the g5 square. White is threatening to win the bishop with h5, so h6 is the usual choice. Now white played knight f3. I think the thinking was traditionally that knight d7 was the main move to stop knight e5, but as Magnus Carlsen showed, and in this game, black actually doesn't have to play knight d7. It seems knight e5 is not such a big deal. Black just carries on with e6, and we see after knight e5 the bishop can drop back to h7. This is not such a big deal and is again a solid position potentially for black. We see bishop d3, which does actually, by the way, leave this d pawn hanging. Just to explore this theoretically, if queen takes d4, and I'll put on a Kb1 here just to make absolutely sure of side variations, the move here would be knight takes f7 to try and exploit the queen slightly loose for this bishop g6 check. So if the king takes, bishop g6 check, and we'd win the queen after. But things are not that simple, because here black plays bishop takes d3, and white has to play knight takes h8 to have any advantage, any significant advantage to win that rook. Now this seems to allow a very dangerous check, bishop b4 check, and white has to play accurately to secure a good advantage with bishop d2 here. And you know, it seems a little bit scary because queen e5 check, for example. Well, white plays knight e2 and is perfectly okay. So winning that rook and getting away with it. Another alternative to take here, rook b1, check here, the knight again comes back, and this eventually leads to significant advantage for white. So white's got a significant advantage here. Okay, so that's a little trap, but black takes the bishop on d3, queen takes d3, and now we see knight d7, and like in the game against Magnus Carlsen, I believe this is very familiar, f4, and we see bishop b4 check. And you might think, is this a wasted move if the bishop's going back? Well, pawns cannot go backwards, so if this pawn is encouraged forward, it's weakening these two squares, and in particular weakening the d3 square could be useful for later, for tactical ideas along that d file, like c5 or knight c5s later if the queen is looser. So it's creating some weaknesses basically, and the bishop just goes to e7 now. So it's not time wasted if it's encouraging pawns to commit themselves. They can't go backwards. So we see now bishop d2 from Vishy, knight gf6, and now castling queenside. So a very aggressive setup for white. It seems in one respect the bishop's blocked in by its own pawns, but this knight on e5 can spearhead attacks quite often. Black castles kingside, and we see queen f3, and here things are very interesting. If black wants to try and play what usually is a thematic move to play c5, we need to explore this at different points in this game. Now at this point, to play c5, this might be plausible actually here, and I think after the game Andreikin expressed that he should have tried to play c5 earlier. This might be a valid place to play it. D takes, for example, bishop takes. White's okay, but I think black's okay as well, and it's kind of that semi-open c-file pressure can lead to tactical resources later and counterplay. and it's assessed actually about equal this position here. So this might have been a time where c5 was possible, but instead Queen c7 was played. And now actually Vishy kind of makes c5 from black far less attractive. He plays c4 here. Now all of a sudden c5 has a good response to it based on tactics, concrete tactics in the position. If c5 in this position, white can actually play, believe it or not, d5. And you might think, doesn't this just lose a pawn? Well, actually that's a little bit of a trap. If the pawn is taken, if knight takes e5, f takes, now unless you want to allow d6, which is a disaster, you'll take this, but here bishop f4 actually wins the queen. The queen hasn't got any squares here, hasn't got d4 or anything. It's actually trapped in this position. So in effect c4 has stamped out c5, because this is actually quite an undesirable position, the d5 in this position. Even if black doesn't take, I mean, what other options? E takes. Here this is undesirable actually for another reason, knight f5. So we're hitting the bishop, and also we've got queen g3 on the cards hitting g7. So again, tactically this doesn't seem that appealing. Bishop d8 for example, queen g3, knight h5, knight takes h6 check, and this is dangerous for black. Queen d3. White's doing very well in fact in this position. So it is already quite dangerous to react with c5 now. The specifics of the position with forcing moves dictate black's going to be worse. So actually black now tries to generate counterplay using the a pawn. So if a pawn can come here and weaken some dark squares, then this bishop's going to be more useful, and maybe tactics on the dark squares later are going to be important. White plays king b1, and now we see rook ad8. And now bishop c1 here. And again, we need to examine c5 in this position. If c5 in this position, d5, again, the trap is actually working for the queen. There, that still is valid. And also, so we just quickly check, e takes d5 again. Knight f5 is still valid. So that weakening the f5 square for a knight on f5 is very, very dangerous, it seems, for black. This in conjunction with queen g3. This position, if that h6 pawn is lost, it's actually worse than before here. After queen d3 check. Now here, if king takes h6, knight takes f7 as a mate in 3. So yeah, this is all pretty dangerous, allowing knight f5 still on d5 ed, knight f5. Very, very dangerous stuff indeed. It seems just a broken position for black. On knight e4 there's knight takes f7. So okay, so black continues with the a pawn, trying to generate counterplay with the a pawn. Rook he1, securing the knight now, making d5 even more comfortable, potentially. We see a3. White doesn't want to fracture his pawn structure and give black playing a5. He wants to keep the lines closed, so b3 seems entirely natural. But it does weaken some dark squares, and actually bishop b4, hitting the rook. The rook now moves to e3, so it can usefully either swing to support the d pawn or the g file later on g3 potentially. Now it's here that black does play the move c5, and this might not be brilliant even in this position. White continues now with d5, and now this dreaded ed. So in other variations knight f5 was really dangerous. Now here knight f5 is actually picked up by the engine even in this position as being a reasonable move. Knight f5, so as a pawn sack, threatens queen g3. What does black actually do? If d takes, it gets a bit hairy with queen g3 because the knight h5. It's not so convincing as before actually. But knight takes c4, just suspending operations for a moment, is actually dangerous in its own right for things like g4 and g5. But it's a bit murky. So Vishy actually for the moment, he just takes on d5. He's got that f5 square. With h6 it's more difficult to do something about a knight landing on f5. So it seems black's position looks fairly dangerous. But after knight b6, black is putting a lot of pressure now on the d pawn. Vishy actually takes time to protect that. So the two rooks and the queen protect against the two knights and the rook. And now we see queen c8. And here, black is potentially playing rook d6 and to double after that, potentially. We'll just keep a blockade. But white doesn't allow that to happen. The blockade immediately with rook d6, let's have a quick look at that. Well, knight f5. That's a pain. So with this queen c8, we see actually though white playing d6 now. So he's extended the scope of his queen. The pawn is looking dangerous for d7s in the future. White is looking actually much better here. Black played now rook fe8. This might not be technically best from an engine perspective. It's starting to get dangerous. c4 trying to open up lines instead. If we take, what's the idea of this pawn sack? If knight takes c4, d7 is strong. So for example like this. Now taking here, that d pawn is very, very dangerous. And we can actually pick up this and actually we're winning an exchange as well. So the d pawn is really dangerous in these variations. So okay, c4 doesn't look entirely attractive, but black's rook fe8 seems to be, technically it's increasing white's advantage. We're talking like almost 1.5 units or more now, according to Houdini. So white was doing exceptionally well in this position, and it looks like it. It looks like this is a menacing passed pawn, threatening d7 almost. And it's only like these two defenders stopping that. And in fact, Vichy now plays what seems to be an entirely logical move, knight h5. Okay, the queen c8 had discouraged knight f5, but knight h5 looks at g7 as well as f6, which could have implications for playing d7. So now we see black trying to defend here with rook e6. And even now in this position, it seems engines are screaming for the move d7. Let's have a look. So this is like +7 apparently, d7, believe it or not. +7 position. Look at all of white's pieces, they seem highly coordinated. Beautiful knights, beautiful rooks. What does black do here? If knight takes, then queen g4, and we're threatening mate. If g6 here, black's crumbling. Knight takes f7. King takes f5. This is crunching for black, it seems. For example, taking here, queen g7, and we've got actually technically a forced mate in 8, believe it or not, in this position. The engine suggests it's a forced mate in 8. So that was a way of prizing open black's king position here. Just this move d7. So knight f takes d7 doesn't seem to do that well. Knight b takes d7. Then knight takes f6. Now we can't take with the knight because of that pin on d8. We take the rook, then knight takes d7, just winning material. It seems d7 looks crushing. What could have dissuaded Vichy from this? Queen b8. We've got a very intriguing tactical idea here, actually, in terms of f5. Intriguing. So offering the knight on e5 looks strange. But knight takes f6 check here, and if g takes, bishop takes h6 is actually a forced mate, it seems. The king safety has been completely compromised. Black is getting mated, it seems. Say the engine is giving rook e4 as a desperate measure, just to demonstrate, for example, queen g4 and queen g7 as the basic sort of mate pattern. So it seems this is absolutely crunching this move. If rook e7, again, knight takes f6, and this is looking terrible after bishop takes h6. So there seems to be a technical opportunity here after this rook e6 to play d7. It does seem to be, on the evidence I have here available, a kind of virtual knockout blow, but it requires this very interesting f5 move. And you might think, well, what about queen takes e5? Well, we can either just take the rook here, black's not threatening a mate or anything, or even stronger apparently is rook e3. So that's even stronger, and if the queen goes back, we just take on e6. It's a disaster for black. It's interesting, d7, it just seems crushing in all variations. So just have a look at some other ideas. If rook takes d7, again knight takes f6, and then we can just take on d7, just winning material on d7. If queen b8, have we covered that one? I think with f5 we have. It's this f5 is a key move. It's hard for humans to come up with this sort of thing, but it seems devastating. That the rook's purpose on e6 was in one way to stop the double pawns, because once you get the double pawns, then h6 is dropping, then your king is about to be mated on the dark squares after bishop takes h6. So yeah, it does seem crushing. So this was a crushing position. But anyway, knight takes f6 was played instead, which is still giving white a clear advantage. Rook takes f6. And now again, d7 here is quite interesting, but not as good as actually something else. d7 was played here, but actually in this particular position, knight g4 is apparently very, very strong. So let's see, if say rook f5, then actually knight takes h6, g takes queen g4 check. So the rook is only held by the queen, and now we play d7, stamping that protection out. So we're winning the rook on f5. If rook takes, we can actually take on d7 more precisely, then take on f5. So it seems knight g4 is extremely venomous here. We've examined rook f5. If rook e6, then f5, and again I think we're going to dent black's king safety. If rook e8, then in fact even knight f6 check to get this bishop takes h6 potentially is very, very strong. Either bishop h6 or even more strong, queen g4 and then bishop takes h6. This is absolutely winning for white. White has queen h5 simply, and there's no defense really for black apart from giving up the queen. It's devastating stuff. Vishy had an overwhelming position here, but it's the most incisive moves, the way to crash through black's king position. It seems knight g4 in conjunction with d7 and then knight h6. This is in the realms of computer science, of course, these kind of continuations, but if you can see them, then all power to you, you know, because they are ripping open the black's king. So anyway, d7 was played now. Still, white has the advantage. The position, the trump cards of the position haven't disappeared just yet. Black played queen c7. White is technically more than +3 in this position, and Vishy now plays the top engine move, queen g4. So it makes way for rook g3 to try and encourage more weaknesses around black's king. Black's only counterplay, a way of opening lines, the counterbalance, is to play c4 now, it seems, which he does. Now after rook g3 he has to attend to the mate threats. He plays g6, and now white tries to crash through with h5. So this pawn chain is being victimized. Black now takes on b3. At least black has opened up a line, but with no rook to support it because of that pawn depriving the c8 square. Can this attack go anywhere? Well, it is a little bit dangerous. For example, if a takes, black can throw in the pawn sack a2 to open up lines. For example, king a1 check, and this is getting very, very tricky now. Black's got a bit of counterplay. It's scary, but actually even this position apparently is good for white with knight takes g6. Technically, it's still a very, very good position. As long as white doesn't play king takes a2, I think this is asking to get it. If you open up lines, you get mated. So no, the idea is not to open up lines around your own king. So a2 check, we just play king a2, and apparently it's okay as well. So anyway, after c takes b3, there's an even stronger way to avoid even the bishop c3 check, is just to take a little bit of time out off the g file to play rook takes b3. So black is having to find some magical way to get out of this horrendous position. In one aspect of the position, one section of the board, his king's getting ripped apart. In another, there's a gigantic pawn on d7, nullifying his rook. And another, these pieces are kind of being attacked and the pawn on a3 is loose. But white's main attention surely is to try and get black's king above all else. But black now plays an ingenious move in the circumstance. He doesn't move the bishop back. If he moves the bishop back, I'm pretty sure his king's position is going to be fried with h takes g6. fg, knight takes g6, hitting e7 as well. It's just the target, so king h7 is not even possible. Okay, so where can the bishop move without the king being fried? Well, no, black has to go for white's king. It's an emergency now situation. Black plays knight a4. An ingenious move under the circumstance. Says if rook takes b4 here, then it is scary with knight c3 check that the king has to go here on c2. If king a1, knight takes d1, and the point is that this check and picking up the rook is a real nuisance. Rook c4 is possible here though, but if say queen takes d1, then checking actually black's going to be better. If rook c4 in this position, it's still murky. It's not what we want. It's not as clear as before at all. So forget about taking the rook on b4. We don't need to be greedy. Vishy's not greedy here. He just carries on undermining black's king with h takes g6. Now black has to distract at some point, but first he does take time out to play f takes g6. Now here you might think, well, there's two tempting moves. There's taking the bishop or trying to strip the king. If we try and strip the king with knight takes g6, you might be amazed, but actually king h7, and the engines have this as better for black. Say knight e5, then it's black that's getting a few punches in here after knight c3 check. Knight takes d1. Black is now threatening the bishop as well as queen c2. It's horrible. If queen takes check, and you see that this is all gone pear-shaped here for white. So no, not knight takes g6. King h7 would be nasty. No, Vishy actually plays the correct move, one of the more correct, the strongest moves it seems. In rook takes b4, so he's piece up. He's just won a piece, so it's up to black to justify this. He plays knight c3 check. Now the thing is, if king a1, then this is really annoying that knight takes d1 with this loose rook for queen c3 check, as well as queen takes c1. So here it's actually black doing really well after queen c3 check and taking it. Black's winning that. So no, the king has to go in front of a horrible discovered check mechanism. But Vishy is a piece up, and this is total genius now, this next move from black, and resourcefulness. The problem is, if he does any discover check, say knight a4 check, white has rook c4 available, supported by the knight on e5. And after this, it's plain sailing actually. For example, then there's no worries at all. The attack is extinguished. There's nothing. The queen needs support. Hasn't got any real support. The checks will run out. No, black does an ingenious move under the circumstances. In this position, black actually plays b5. It's the best practical chance, it seems, from a human perspective. From an engine perspective, black is busted. Black's been busted for quite a few moves. White now plays king b3, and this is approaching the first time control. So if Vishy crosses the move 40, he'll get an extra hour. Now after knight a4, it seems black is threatening. Well, black is threatening queen c3 check, and it will be checkmate. Now there's actually more than one way of defending this threat of queen c3. There's queen h3, there's queen f3, or there's bishop d2. The thing is with bishop d2, it's not just defending actually, the c3 square, it's actually solidifying the rook on b4 to be potentially less of a loose piece in variations which might follow. And also, furthermore, potentially the bishop might come to this diagonal later. So it's almost a latent attacking move along that diagonal. It wasn't played here, but it seems this is the safest way to navigate the position. And in fact, white can even, after knight c5 check, now that the rook is protected, consider king takes a3, because before this wouldn't have been possible. With the bishop on c1, queen a5 check would have scooped up the rook on b4. If you imagine that bishop there, it would have scooped up the king there, we lose the rook. But here, this is entirely possible for white. And okay, it looks a little bit dangerous, but white has resources here to defend. a4, so after knight takes a4, king c2, this looks scary stuff. But remember, white's piece up with a big pawn on d7, so if the checks run out, then it's the end of the party for black. Check here. Now the safest is not here, although that is very good as well, but actually to return the king here, and we see that it's starting to stabilize. Knight c3 check, bishop takes, queen takes, but you'd have to have some nerves of steel to play like this, even though there's only, like, it seems, a rook and a queen working here. But you've got to factor the other one in as well. But in this position, it seems the steam runs out. If rook here, for example, then we just queen the pawn, so that rook's not going to move anywhere. The steam has run out of black's attack. So fundamentally, from a human perspective, if there's anything to pick up, any intuitive insight to pick up here, is that maybe, as well as defending a key square, it's to solidify pieces. So bishop d2 kind of ticks 2 boxes intuitively, but maybe even a third box if the bishop can be useful later on the diagonal. So it seems, yeah, the knight c5 check gives white an extra option of king takes a3. What was played was actually queen f3. And now this isn't possible. This knight c5 check, king takes a3 is not really possible, because queen a5 check, picking up the rook, and that gives black too much counterplay really. If white's better, it's much more difficult than before. So in the game, anyway, after knight c5 check, we see king c2, and this check, and this is discussed at length in another specific video. This particular position, where there exists 2 technical resources now, both a bit scary to play. I just only want to touch on those briefly. I'll put a link to the specific video about those. I mentioned in detail in the video about king d2 and rook c4 before. In the rook c4 line, though, it's interesting here. So white voluntarily is sacrificing the entire rook to be the exchange down, basically. And it turns out that in this position, there's a few good moves available. Not just queen takes a3 as mentioned in the specific video, but also bishop takes a3. And it seems, okay, white's the exchange down, but has a fantastic game here. The d7 pawn has been reinforced quite strongly, and white threatens all sorts of things like bishop e7 and queen d5. And this wasn't discussed in the other video, but it seems, okay, black still has resources, and white has to, win this game. If black offers to go back to counter-sack the exchange again, then this is tricky, because black's now looking at queen b2 here, cheekily. So queen a3, protecting b2. Queen b7. Let's go with this, trying to get some counterplay for the rook. Check. 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 And what does white actually play here? Would white really want to calculate this sort of stuff? If he plays king a1, then queen e5 is equal. White would actually have to play knight d3 in this position. So even this stuff is really hairy, but with knight d3 apparently white gets an advantage again. But really, is Vishy going to really calculate all this stuff when all he needs to maintain his dominant tournament position is a draw, as discussed at length in the other video? So no, he didn't go for this going the exchange down line with rook c4. There's also king d2 as discussed as well. No, he just accepted the draw by repetition. But I hope this video in particular has explored the backdrop to getting to this critical position, and so the two videos kind of complement each other. So I hope that's given some more insight of what really went on in this fantastically complicated game. Credit to both players for showing such tenaciousness and resourcefulness and pragmatism as well, especially on Vishy's part, just to safely get a draw here. And it later was vindicated because he managed to fend off another very, very dangerous opponent in the next round with a draw as well and secure the tournament victory. So he's going to be playing Magnus Carlsen later in the year to try and regain the World Chess Champion title. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.